and it was a really interesting experience. So I'm gonna let Lou introduce himself. Yeah, it's the mic.
Yeah, so my name is Lou Helps, and as Ryan already told you, I'm a second year student in the RPD program here at 12. My research interests primarily concern issues surrounding rural immigration, especially temporary foreign worker programs. So I'm looking at the seasonal agricultural worker program, which brings workers from Mexico, Jamaica, and a handful of other countries to work in our agri-food sector for about 6 to 8 months of the year. So I'll be conducting my thesis research over the course of the next few months, and looking forward to having more to share about that in the future. And Ashley, introduce yourself now.
And don't let the change in hair color fool you. That's still me with the reindeer. And I just want to say those reindeer were fine. They were just molting. They look a little rough, but they were okay. And so my research is mostly focused on place-based innovation. So I want to know what makes certain rural communities thrive in the contemporary economy, and what aspects of place are relevant to those systems. I'm also interested in strategic foresight and how we plan for that thriving and for that innovative future, not just in the next sort of 4 years, but the next 25, the next 50, the next 100. And so Scandinavia is really interesting for that, because I think most of us think, at least when I get very frustrated, I tend to think drop it all, I'm going to move to Sweden or to Denmark because they're really doing it well. And so I really wanted to go and get some ground truthing in Finland. And it was really, really excellent to get to go and do that, and to get to pet some reindeer. Was working.
It might just take a moment.
Yeah, they're an albino reindeer. They're actually kind of unusual. And they said that they hear better for some strange reason. I guess because they're taking more light through they tend to have blue eyes, so their senses go up. To give a little context, and Lou and I just noticed this actually when we were putting the presentation together, that the book highlights sometimes the language differences. That says international should be international comparative rural policy studies. So we're just trying to speak that now as like internation instead. But this is really an ongoing project. As you see on that title page, this was the 16th Summer Institute, so this is something that's been going on for quite a while, and brings together scholars from in North America. It includes historically Black college at Tuskegee in Alabama. Oregon has been a member in the past, here at Guelph.
Autonomous University of the State of Mexico, University of Barcelona,
University of Bologna, and of course, for us this year, the host was the University of Lapland in Rovaniemi, Finland. To give you a little bit of context, and I'll hand it over to Lou in a second, but Rovaniemi is up there. We were on the Arctic Circle. Me personally, and as you see in a couple pictures in a second, I did not pack for 30-degree heat in the Arctic Circle. I figured we were going somewhere cool, and I thought that would be wonderful. And it was hot, and the sun never goes down because you get 24 hours of daylight at that part of the world. But the really, really interesting part about that is that we're really in a region that's incredibly comparable to parts of Northern Ontario and huge chunks of Canada, because we're all part of that circumpolar Arctic Circle.
Yeah, so continue slide here. You can see just how much northern Finland can look a lot like parts of Ontario. Personally, I'm from up near Parry Sound, and this could look like it was right by my house. If we change the slide again. Another thing that you'll notice is that Finland, I don't know what people think Finland will look like, but I expected it to be somewhat mountainous. Maybe I was thinking of Norway or something, but it is actually quite flat. This is from the highest peak in the area of Rovaniemi, which they call a mountain, but is really more of a hill. And it looks out over what you see is really just a nice, gently sloping landscape with a lot of trees and a lot of water. Again, you'll see that this is another landscape that could easily come from Northern Ontario. Windblown pines, exposed granite slabs. Looks like it could be the Canadian Shield. And then the one thing that's very different from my experience with Ontario is, of course, the 24 hours of sunlight that we had. In Rovaniemi, because it is on the Arctic Circle, they have about 2 weeks of midnight sun on either side of the summer solstice. And we were there from June 16th to June 30th. So we never got to see nighttime for the entire 2 weeks. This picture was taken just before midnight. And there's a rainbow. So that gives you an idea of the kind of oddness of what 24/7 sunlight does to you. I think we all started to get a little bit loopy by the end of the 2 weeks because you never get quite the same quality of sleep, especially since we were told we would have blackout blinds, but they never materialized. So that we can change this again. And I'm going to give you a little bit of background information about Lapland and what the scene is like there that we were studying. So Lapland is, of course, the northernmost region of Finland and the European Union. It's bordered on 3 sides by Sweden, Norway, and Russia. We did actually take one little trip, just a dip into Sweden, and the first thing waiting for us on the other side was an IKEA, which I was very happy about. It also, Rovaniemi, the capital of Lapland, also claims to be the official hometown of Santa Claus, though Bracebridge, Ontario claims the same thing. So I'll let you decide which one is the real Santa Claus village. In terms of its economy, Lapland derives a lot from natural resource industries, particularly mining and forestry. But it also has a growing tourism sector, as you can see from these statistics here, mostly from other parts of Eastern Europe and the European Union, but also increasingly from East Asia.
And just a note on the agricultural side of things is really interesting. So for particularly things like hay crops or things that are kind of we think of as growing here in southwestern Ontario, you would get the same sort of second and third cutting of hay across a shorter season because you're having this sort of super growth season, right? You have 24 hours of daylight. And so even though that growing season might be orders of magnitude shorter in terms of the number of weeks in that growing season, you're still getting that productivity. And it's actually a huge part of how they're trying to develop some of the agricultural production in the area. Because you go like gangbusters through the summertime, which wouldn't be new to anybody that's worked in agriculture here in southwestern Ontario either. But to take advantage of that cycle in order to go after sort of a super growing season. The other part of that is that it ends up with sort of almost super nutraceuticals. Right? You have plants that are used in sort of cosmetics or superfoods, sea buckthorn, stuff like that, that grow continuously, and they get this sort of extra boost from continuous photosynthesis, that those are becoming an increasing area of emphasis in terms of crop production. A lot of that has to do with, as well, the landscape doesn't lend itself to the traditional sort of crop agriculture that we think of. So things are based on foraging. So you go out, and when it's 24 hours of daylight, you're foraging kind of, some of the people we're talking to is they're working 18 hours a day, they go home, they sleep for 20 minutes, and then they kind of hibernate in the winter like bears. And I think that's a big part of understanding some of the cultural and the traditional values and the way of thinking around planning for some of the things that are going into both the forestry and the agricultural landscape.
One last thing that is worth noting about Lapland is that it is very sparsely populated, with a density of about 1.8 people per square kilometer, meaning that they have slightly more reindeer than people in their population.
And the funny thing on the tourism side as well is that we've had one of our lecturers say, and Ryan quotes this as well, is that their biggest livestock is tourists. So with $1 billion industry, the most popular land animal in Lapland is, in fact, tourists. So they're building out this year. Oh, that's weird. So how is Lapland kind of thinking about its future? And so some context around these clusters and Arctic smartness, and sort of the title of what we said today's talk would be around, is the European Union has put a lot of emphasis into what they're calling a smart specialization strategy. So there's a huge investment by the European Union in sort of niche-based specialization for different regions around the world, particularly focused on what they would categorize as vulnerable or lagging regions. Those are often rural and remote periphery areas, to try and figure out how to support their economy into the future when you don't have the agglomeration benefits that you would have in a major urban center, right? So how do you kind of replicate or do things in place of the density benefits that you would get in a large urban center and the spin-offs around it? Rovaniemi is a mid-sized city in terms of the North American scale, but the density between any of those other centers where you might have population clusters can be hundreds of kilometers. So you have to think around, how do we develop clusters that take into account sparse population, take into account huge distances between center of density. And what they've done with this is they've developed what they call Arctic smartness. So this is essentially their branding for how they're going to pursue a variety of territorial-based innovation projects. Their 5 main pillars are around the development of a circular economy, and they're doing this not only in what we think of as a circular economy. I think it's just starting here in North America, and it's starting on areas related to agricultural production, fisheries. In Finland, because they depend so heavily on mining and forestry, they're trying to think around, how do we take an industry that is essentially very waste heavy and find ways to capture some of the economic and ecological benefits outside of that cycle. So you're diverting more waste or not creating that waste to begin with, and finding purposes for it in exactly what it sounds like, in a circle. So let's feed into it. Part of that is this idea of an Arctic smart rural community. So there's a really big focus on supporting what you might think of as sort of quote unquote traditional rural enterprises. So a lot of things related to agriculture and food, small innovation centers related to value add products in terms of the agri-food value chain. That includes things from, so like those super nutraceuticals, finding ways to include those in vitamins, in cosmetics, in sort of superfood production at a small scale, all the way through to local vocational colleges, acting sort of as renters or a space where you might have someone that's producing ice cream, or a butcher on site where you're also having dairy herd management studies for students. So, you know, dairy that's being harvested from the dairy farm for the dairy herdsman program gets then sold at a wholesale price to the ice cream producer. Meat from cull cows is put into the butcher, and you kind of have not just this, you should come be part of the system because it's a nice thing to do, but there's a real economic benefit to that, right? The third is this idea around developing the Arctic environment, and that's something that was quite challenging, I think, for some of us to think about. A lecture that kind of posed this idea that climate change might benefit northern Finland, because you would have the opportunity to produce more crops, different crops, things like corn further north. Me personally really struggled with that, because that feels like it kind of feels like, well, we'll stay warm while the house is burning down, for lack of a better way to put it. And I think that that's something that is part of the reality of trying to figure out what are we going to do with a changing climate and spin it in a way that feels less scary, knowing that this is going to be a reality. But it's part of their conversation around how do we protect ecological sensitivity. We know the things that make the Arctic special. Moving forward. The other ones are things like Arctic design and really playing into the things that make the Arctic community different. And then the last one is safety. So with the influx of tourism, with the promotion of different kinds of agricultural production, with forestry and mining, how do we make sure that people are safe in this thing? So if you're having a whole lot of tourists come from particularly large groups from Asia that are now coming to Lapland and have never been on an ice floe, so they want to go out in the middle of the river and stare at the northern lights and wonder why this might not be safe. How do you not make sure that there aren't businesses that are capitalizing on these opportunities in ways that might put people in danger, because you need to be knowledgeable about going out into the woods in the middle of the winter time. And then how do you make sure that all of these things are operating in a way that doesn't endanger the environment and the people of Lapland?
You can keep going. I don't want to touch that.
I think a lot of students at ICRPS really found the clusters and how this was framed a little bit challenging. I think you have to understand the context of the European Union and their framework around Horizon 2020. So I really encourage you to kind of go look that up if this is something that's interesting to you. But this cluster development is a really important pillar in terms of how they're investing in projects. So developing these 5 clusters and creating a process to work through this is really heavily tied to funding. This is a really important bit around how they get money from the European Union to promote these projects. And something important to note is that a lot of the Lapland organizations, whether that's the University of Lapland, whether that's businesses, have gotten together kind of as their own regional body or regional economic development organization, and they often bypass Helsinki, which is the Finnish capital, to go straight to the European Union. And a lot of that has to do with their perception that Helsinki's got its own priorities. The southern part of Finland is so vastly different than the northern part. If we've got things we want to move forward with, we should just go and do them. So this creates kind of an interesting model around figuring out how you pursue investment dollars. It is also to be perfectly blunt, direct investment into private enterprise development, right? This is all designed around how do you create products and services that scale and produce an economic benefit. That's a really, really heavy emphasis as part of these initiatives, and that's a heavy emphasis across the European Union when it comes to the smart specialization idea. The community and social development aspects of that are something that are sometimes underplayed and often not discussed a whole lot. So when you look at this sort of 5 Arctic smartness clusters and how they development, they've put this almost like Monopoly, right? You can follow this all the way around of saying, I have an idea, I need to research it, I gotta wait 2 throws to develop it in the meantime with local businesses. I gotta put it into the Arctic Smartness cluster funding in order to find access to that funding all the way through up through these vertical streams. And then I go back to square one to research how that's happening. So it becomes kind of its own machine, right? Not dissimilar from our policy cycles around how we invest in rural economic development here, right? You try a pilot project, it goes back to the government, you try another pilot project and keeps going from there. It's just maybe a little bit more formalized, and the emphasis is on private sector development.
All right, so now I'm going to talk a little bit about kind of why I wanted to go to ICRPS in Finland in the first place and some of what I took away from it. So my main reason for wanting to go in the first place was to have the opportunity to collaborate and interact with scholars from a range of rural policy related backgrounds and a range of different international perspectives. And I certainly got that opportunity. ICRPS is a place where, as we were saying earlier, people, both faculty and students from both sides of the Atlantic and now increasingly different parts of the world gather to discuss rural policy issues and compare how these issues are impactful and how they are dealt with in their own home countries. And so this was a really great opportunity to meet with these scholars and talk about some of our ideas and potentially establish relationships to work together in the future, which of course is a very important thing in academia. My expectations going into ICRPS were that I was going to find an extremely different rural policy landscape than I was familiar with, because I thought that Finland is a world away from what I know. I think I had a vision of Finland as being like Denmark or Norway, and having this kind of Scandinavian type of kind of policy environment. But of course, Finland is its own thing. It's actually not a part of Scandinavia. It's its own, completely own culture and history and language. In fact, if you ever go and you overhear Finnish, you will be shocked at just how different it is. I was very excited when I found out that to say hello in Finnish, you say hey, but the similarities end there. So you find this situation where it's actually much more similar to Canada than you might expect in a lot of ways. The landscape is very similar. The policies that they use are in many ways very similar, but there's this kind of uncanny valley thing happening where it looks like Canada and feels like Canada, but it's also decidedly not Canada because there's this whole history and all of these traditions that are also impacting the policy there. So I came away with this idea that rural policy and rural development in many ways are influenced by the very local and place-based histories and traditions and cultural aspects that inform those policies. And to illustrate what I mean by that, I'll give you an example. So in Finland, there is this right that is enshrined in law called the everyman's right, where any person can go into the forest and use the natural products of that forest. So you can go into a forest, even if it's privately owned, and collect mushrooms or berries or whatever other natural products you want to use. You're not allowed to interfere with someone's lawn or garden or go too close to their house or go into a farmer's field. But the forest is open for everyone, which is a radical concept to us, where in Canada, private property is so sacred and you can't trespass on that. But in Finland, it's very normal because the idea of going into the forest and foraging has been a very important part of their culture for centuries upon centuries. And so it's become enshrined as a right in their modern policy. However, there's also sort of a dark side to this story, because with the natural products industry that's sprung up there, a lot of the time they don't have enough employees anymore to go out and actually harvest the products that we need. There aren't a lot of people, young people in Lapland who want to go out and pick berries for a living, especially since so many people now are moving to Helsinki or to the UK or somewhere else abroad. And so increasingly, these private companies that take advantage of the everyman's right have taken to hiring foreign laborers, especially from Thailand. And so they bring them in on contracts, but those contracts only entitle them to work as entrepreneurs and sell the berries to the private companies. And so there have been a lot of cases of people being taken advantage of, being brought into Finland to harvest berries out of the forest, and then actually ending up with less money than they started with. And so it just goes to show you that these traditions and this history can result in both positive and negative outcomes when it works its way in policy. And so my ultimate takeaway that I got from this experience with ICRPS is that comparative rural policy studies gives us an opportunity to explore the ways in which our own individual contexts inform the policies and the problems that we encounter and the solutions that we come up with to solve those problems.
So for me, I would echo a lot of what Lou said there, as well as you go into these places and think, I'm going to find all the answers. Right? I'm going to find everything I need to know to finish my dissertation. Watch out, I'm going to be done in a year. I'm going to come home and I'm going to go so fast. To say that didn't happen is a gross understatement. So for me, I was really excited to go to Scandinavia, mostly because of in the innovation literature, particularly in that kind of progressive, holistic idea of how we think about community or state-led innovation. These are really, Scandinavia are the three countries that we look to all the time. And certainly in the Canadian context, having previously worked in public policy, we tend to kind of import those things wholesale and say, well, it worked in Denmark or it worked in Finland, it should work here. And kind of going and getting the opportunity to see what was actually happening on the ground. And, to see that on a day-to-day basis, rural businesses, farmers, rural researchers have the same kind of things that we do, where we have these grand overarching policy schemes, but in your day-to-day business, it's not really the most impactful thing that you're thinking about all the time, right? You're thinking about the project in front of you, and then also thinking, how do I fit this into a funding scheme that will get me the investment I need in order to continue? So this was a kind of good from the perspective of getting some of that humility of saying, okay, well, we're all in the same boat, right? We're all struggling with these same questions. In terms of how do we deal with demographic change? How do you deal with rural outmigration? How do you keep people in your local economy, understanding that economy is changing quite rapidly and people are struggling to develop that kind of crystal ball idea around foresight? The other part of this is that having the opportunity to talk to rural scholars that are focusing on these questions from a variety of countries was really, really interesting to reflect on the strengths that we have when we talk about the Canadian rural policy development landscape. I would say that my reflection is that we kind of shocked a couple people, because we'd sit down and we'd have these informal conversations with people. We'd talk about our challenges or our kind of critique of what's happening, and there is a really overwhelmingly positive view of Canada, if there is a view at all. To be perfectly honest, most Europeans in this context, in the OECD context, kind of go, oh, right, Canada's a country too. Right? So I think that in terms of understanding our place in that global rural policy development landscape, it's eye-opening to think about, most people, when they think of North America, they think of the United States. They're not really thinking of Canada. And then the other aspect is that we're far more self-critical of the things that we're doing than some other countries are. We were actually talking about this yesterday. The opportunity to get to talk to other bodies just by virtue of how they're structured was really, really interesting to think about. Most of the research that gets done here in CEDRED often takes that critical lens of not just a description of what's happening, but then the so what factor, right? Now, what do we do with that information? How do we form a recommendation about something, some way to move forward? Whereas we talked to some colleagues at other institutions, and it was really focused on, well, we're going to describe what's happening, and it's really for politicians or for someone else to decide what to do with it. And that's such a different perspective, right, on the role of rural research in these conversations, that you can be I think you can be not neutral while also not being political, because my perspective on that. And a lot of this has to do with wrestling with the kind of the global restructuring of both research, of how academic institutions function, the kind of the formation of the neoliberal university, as well as the global restructuring around how we do community development. And these are things that we're all wrestling with. And so it was really, really interesting to sit down with people from Italy and really work through these questions around, if we're all struggling with these things, how do we bridge that comparative policy aspect of things? How do you do comparison when you can acknowledge that our place, how we feel in these things are fundamentally different, but we're wrestling with the same questions? And I'm not sure that, I mean, if we come up with the answer to that, we won't be here. But the other aspect of that is that it did create these opportunities that, I'm going to develop papers out of ICRPS. It's incredibly professionally rewarding. The contacts that I've made there are going to contribute to publications that will kind of help start wrestling with these questions and deal with those in a more interesting way. And the aspect of that too is who belongs in rural futures. We had these really interesting conversations, particularly with the students from Tuskegee, who in an overwhelmingly ethnically monoculture in Scandinavia, we're really trying to figure out, okay, we're having all these conversations about what this means. Where do I fit? Where do I fit coming from a historically Black college, coming from the American South? What does that look like? Who is part of this picture? It's not just technology, it's not just economic development. There's a social aspect to this that we have to deal with as well. So place really, really matters in terms of getting to those stories and having the opportunity to share those experiences, because it shapes who we are and how we show up at things. And it was really fascinating to kind of sit down and be like, well, this would just never happen in our context, or to say that we have a particular view of a global policy issue that other people that were maybe in a different context had a totally different view, but we were kind of trying to solve it in the same way. This was really fascinating, particularly the immigration question, the parallels drawn between your work with the Mexican SWAT program versus the Thai workers community berry picking. Really, really interesting to get to have those chats around. There are trends that we need to pay attention to, and are we really paying close attention to them? So that's us with Santa. You can see how happy I was the instant I turned into a 6-year-old. You can also see Louise, one of our colleagues up in the upper right, was terrified. But this kind of gives you, this was mostly your Brian's missing from it, unfortunately, but you get a sense of how many people were involved in these conversations and the opportunity that we got to talk with people about their histories while getting to enjoy some really interesting stuff like meeting Santa and eating reindeer. And getting to explore it. It's delicious, but they're cute and tasty. It's fine. And a really big part of that is this conversation of, so what comes after? What comes after ICRPS? How do you take these relationships and move them into something that's going to move the policy conversation forward? So for me, it was a really great exercise, and not just no one can tell me what to do, but together we can kind of have this conversation together around figuring out what that looks like.
Yeah, no, I would echo that as well, that it was an excellent opportunity just to meet with people who often came from very different backgrounds than me and had very different skill sets. In this room of people, we had economists, and we had people who were working with sustainability or agriculture or social policy. So there was a real diversity of voices in the room. And I think both of us met multiple people who we'd love to collaborate with in the future. So it really shows you the power of these kinds of events in bringing people from different parts of academia together and inspiring what could potentially be some really great work.
And so if you're interested in ICRPS, so we don't need to get into logistics today, but Ryan asked me to plug that there's an information meeting coming up in a couple weeks on October 16th. So if you're curious about the next iteration of ICRPS, it's happening in Brandon next summer. So it flip-flops back and forth between Europe and North America every other year. And this coming year, the focus will be on rural futures and what does that conversation looks like. There'll also be a conference attached to ICRPS this year. Thankfully, they've put that at the beginning of ICRPS rather than the end of a very intense 2 weeks. I know that all of us kind of slept for 3 days after we finished the program. And you can find out all kinds of great information about the logistics of applying, what that looks like, what's involved at at that session, as well as at 2020.icrps.org. If you're curious about Brandon itself, Bill Ashton and Wayne Kelly out of the RDI at Brandon University are the folks that you should get in touch with. Here it's Ryan, not to add more emails to his inbox, which he needs so desperately. But you can talk to Ryan about what that looks like for you as part of your studies. I would say, and I just invite Lou to say as well, for me, I came in knowing the second I heard about this, I wanted to do it. And I geared a lot of my work towards going to ICRPS because it was something that I considered very important, both for the reasons that we said around connecting with people that were going to help me finish this crazy thing around doing a PhD, but who were going to work with for the rest of my career. And so I can't stress how valuable this was. And I know Scott's attended. You were nice. Did you go to ICRPS? Yeah. And we've had a number of people in the department with a very strong wealth representation at ICRPS, and it's been really, really valuable. I think you could talk to Lascelles been, you were to Barcelona, some graduates, Neil Stoop and Mallory Smith, both went to Barcelona as well, and Marc Antoine, who's on the online, and I don't know if we can hear Mark. I would just invite Mark to kind of share if you had any things you wanted to say, Mark.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, great. Yeah, you did a pretty good explanation of what it was, and I can add 2 points. First, I was really surprised about how the EU research politics were shaping how the research and the development were done. So you explained the clusters, how it was important for them to frame their funding to fit the clusters and how they were focused on private enterprise. So I think that was really interesting to see how the influence of how the research is organized and how politics can influence this. And the second thing that I felt was really interesting is that, as you mentioned, they are facing a lot of similar issues that we are facing here. And feeling I had was that the issues are global. So that's really, so everybody's facing the same problem. And so it's really hard to isolate the problem to fix them. So I felt those were two big takeaway that I had from ICRPS.
No, I think we basically covered it.
So that's our reflections of things. Do folks have questions about what Finland was up to, what the ICRPS experience was like? We have a good 20-25 minutes to kind of have a good chat if folks have things they want to know about it. Scott and myself for sure, like chime in on your experiences in Ireland and Barcelona as well. If folks have more ICRPS related questions versus Finland ones. I think ICRPS is totally an adjective.
That's a word.
Yeah, that's a word. Yeah.
About what's the rural life looks like? Like, is it all rural or there are little hubs of village, city type of life? You said it looks like Northern Ontario. Is that the whole country?
Well, so when I say it looks like Northern Ontario, it's certainly a large part of the country. At the beginning, before ICRPS actually started, we both took a train ride out from Helsinki to Rovaniemi, which takes about 11 hours, 12 hours?
13, maybe?
Yeah, so there's an overnight train, but of course we could see everything because the sun never set. So we saw about 2/3 of the country go past our windows on the train ride. And a lot of the country does look like that landscape dotted with lakes and covered in pine forests. There's also, of course, a lot of agricultural land, a lot of fields. But I would say that, especially in Lapland, large parts of the country are characterized by relatively small and self-contained urban hubs with not a lot of sprawl, and then a lot of very sparsely populated rural land. Similar to what you might find in mid to northern Ontario.
And Finland has a really interesting post-war history that at least certainly for me, kind of growing up in the Canadian public school system, right, we don't spend a lot of time thinking about the Eastern Front on things, right? So we tend to focus more on the Allied involvement or what's happening in Britain and Germany, very, very little beyond that. And so Finland, my understanding is they kind of played to both sides during the Second World War, and to their great detriment. So when the Germans left, they essentially burned everything down, and so did the Russians. And so you have to understand that Finland, architecturally, in terms of that kind of, when you go to Copenhagen or you go to a kind of other old European cities, has a very, it would feel much like landing here at the University of Guelph. It's very brutalist. There's a lot of kind of 8-story concrete rectangles. And in parts of Helsinki, you kind of feel like if I stand still for longer than 5 minutes, someone is going to build one of those 8-story concrete rectangles around me. But in Lapland, so you kind of have a lot of new architecture going up, as well as the fact that Finland was a very poor country until kind of the late 60s. So a lot of this kind of this forward-thinking development, a lot of the innovation things that were going along with science related to that led to wealth generation is relatively recent. So you have a different landscape related to that. And it would be kind of like Rovaniemi itself is quite significantly smaller than Guelph, but has a similar feel to it in terms of being a city surrounded by a largely rural landscape.
Absolutely. Another thing that's just interesting to add to that conversation around how a lot of what you see in the built environment in Finland is very new. The entire city of Rovaniemi, as you said, burnt to the ground at the end of World War II. And so when they were going through the process of reconstruction, they hired a very famous Finnish architect named Alvar Aalto to redesign the city. And the design that they settled on is in the shape of a reindeer's head, actually, in case you didn't get the idea that reindeer are super important to them. And so you see a lot of really interesting ideas, some of them good, some of them a little weird, that come out of that kind of rapid change over and rapid innovation. And it makes this certainly a very interesting environment.
That was an interesting slide, that the one that you have with all the different elements for the for the development. You have the top on the European Union related to what you're talking about that one. So it's interesting because you consider the politics, as you were saying, Ashley. Finland has kind of a similar situation as Canada has in terms of the Arctic and how the intensification of research has gone there because things are changing, right? But they're also, the neighbor is Russia. And if I remember correctly, I mean, that was a long time ago I was there, but still, they had this, it's an ominous sort of thought that's always there in the mind of the Finnish people about Russia. And because of the reindeer, they share the reindeer, right? And the roots of the reindeer migrating goes from Russia to Finland, right? They cross. So, you know what? It must have been interesting for you from the rural perspective and having this input of circular economy and wonderful words like that. But still, there's all these things that, you know, they're also developing because they need to strengthen the borders, right?
Of course, yeah. It's so the interesting part, yeah, I love this that's what just before I answer the question, that's what downtown, the grid for downtown Rovaniemi looks like. So you can see the antlers and the nose, and it's really easy to all of a sudden be like, which antler am I in? Am I in the eyeball? I don't know what's going on. So that's just sort of some ideas around how Alvar decided to make Rovaniemi interesting. But absolutely, and to your question, so Lapland is actually not just northern Finland. Lapland is that whole region across Norway, Finland, Sweden, and Russia across that Arctic Circle. So they think of themselves as Lappish more so than they think of themselves as Finnish. And this is a really important distinction as well. And then you also have this layering of the Nordic Council versus Scandinavia versus the European Union. So you kind of have these kind of shifting regional priorities around what goes around it. It's hard to tell if that's actually right
I
here.
can see it. So this is the nose here, right? You can see the shape of the snout, and then the spyways going up there, the antlers. I don't know if it was worth it.
But certainly kind of the Red Scare thing that we think of from the North American context is much different because they're your neighbors, but they're also very powerful neighbors that have kind of capricious political changes. And how to deal with that in the context of the European Union and the changes related to that. I was really struck by the complexity of the layers of policy development. So you have European Union policy, you have national policy, you have Nordic Council policy, you have Arctic Circle governance. And so you're trying to keep track of where something fits. And we did have someone come and talk to us about the development of Finnish rural policy. And I still don't know that I understand where the money came from and went, around who did what and how it was funded. Even the way universities are funded is really different. We think of them as strictly public, at least I do, and the Canadian context is strictly public institutions. There it's a little bit more different in that, it's a little bit different in that the University of Lapland and other institutions where we were hosted have some private equity, there's some public equity, they are kind of their own corporation unto themselves in some regards. And so it's really messy. So not just the Russian kind of that social legacy around that, but you have these really messy policy environments of kind of who am I reporting to at any given time.
Yeah, an interesting thing to note about that as well actually is that the region of Lapland in Finland does not have a government per se. There's no like legislature or anything like that of Lapland. Instead, since it is such a sparsely populated area, and a lot of services are very difficult for the municipalities to deliver on their own because they're so small, they actually form a council of the local, of all the municipalities in Lapland. And that essentially delivers much of the same services that you would expect from, say, an upper tier municipality or a regional municipality here in Ontario. So it's actually a strikingly similar system that they have, just with the absence of provincial government.
It's crazy to think about.
So like there are a bunch of municipalities.
Yeah, that sort of pool resources together and form a council in order to deliver services more efficiently over a wider area.
It says a lot about you don't need politicians.
Well, even their political structure in those councils is really interesting. So they have what I would think of as a CAO, and I'm not sure how familiar folks are with the municipal structure here in Ontario, but what you think of as your chief administrative officer, to me, that's always a bureaucrat, right? Like that's a hired civil servant that's separate from the political side of things. In the local council we went to, again, and some of it is an interesting thing around the language barrier, right? Too, where you're asking a question and they're very complex and you're often talking to people's second and third language. And so you're trying to kind of decipher codes across each other around what do you mean and what is that question? I'm still not sure we got really to the answer of whether their city manager was, I think she was elected. She's elected, but runs the city like we would think of as a hired CAO who would be an employee of council, right? And then you also have another body, which is the Sami Parliament, which is kind of a quasi-governmental, independent, sovereign thing, and kind of not. And the relationship there is really interesting. So who's a political leader and whose staff is a lot different than here.
For those who don't know, also the Sami are Finland's indigenous people. And it's a very complicated situation because a lot of people, there's not really set boundaries between who is Sami and who is not. But there is definitely a very real Sami tradition that has been kept alive, and a lot of people who identify as Sami, and they have formed their own sort of self-governing processes. But it's a very different kind of indigenous governance than we'd be familiar with here in Canada.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's just teasing apart the governance and government and structures has been something that I've been playing with a lot since I came back, trying to wrap my head around that. It's really interesting. Is there any like ICRPS related questions around like what it's like to be at this ICRPS, around what it's like to participate in the Summer Institute, or folks that are considering maybe Brandon that want to know more a bit about what it's like? What is it like? Or Sarah? Yeah. What?
I was going to say, do you have any advice for students who are, and maybe this can go to LaSalle and Scott as well, any advice for students thinking about?
Yeah, the first one is go.
Yeah.
Sure.
I mean, apply it.
Yeah. It's really intense. So, you know, if you're planning to go to ICRPS, plan for that to be kind of the thing that you do, and for a week to recover afterwards. It's, you know, there's a lot of lecture content, there's a lot of group work involved. You do produce, and I think the emphasis in 2020 is to produce something a little bit more of a takeaway around something that might be workable into a future publication or a project. So you're in this 24 hours a day for 2 whole weeks or a little bit longer with 25 other people, right? So we jokingly called it a little bit like summer camp on steroids for nerds. It's you're in there really, really intensively doing this work, which is wonderful, right? How often do you get 2 full weeks to concentrate on nothing but the stuff you think about all the time? So I think that in terms of that advice around applying to go is if you're considering it at all, is to look that up. There's a lot of funding support available for those through different avenues. And the opportunity to get to meet other scholars is like bar none, particularly if you're a master's student and you're looking for people that might be a potential PhD advisor or folks that are working on projects that you might want to pursue in the future. This is a fabulous opportunity to connect with people that may be able to supervise these projects later.
Yeah, I would 100% echo that advice. If it is at all something that sounds interesting to you, I would highly recommend that you at least apply. It sounds like a very big commitment because it's taking over 2 weeks out of your summer that you can't work, and there are costs associated with it. But like Ashley said, there's help for a lot of those costs. In our case, a decent chunk of the cost was covered, so it was very doable for us. And the opportunity that you have to interact with faculty and students that might be valuable connections in the future is huge in terms of career implications. And also just, it's a really fun time. We had a lot of fun hanging out with the other students and the faculty for 2 weeks in Finland. Made some great friends that we still talk to, and it's the most fast-paced bonding you'll ever do with a group of people because you're spending about like 12 hours a day together for a solid 2 weeks. So yeah, it's just a great experience that I highly recommend.
Yeah, may I add something?
Yeah.
Yeah, I would say a lot of the discussion or really interesting discussion I had were not only during the lectures with on different project, but was also outside of those lecture when you're walking somewhere, you take the time to discuss with other students and faculty. And I felt this one-on-one was also really, really interesting because you can really see what personally those people are thinking and how they see the world and how they see those different issues and solution. So that was really, really interesting from that perspective.
No, but I have a question. We saw some pictures from some of your field trips.
Mm-hmm.
What were the highlights from the field trips? What were some of the primary field trips that you went on?
Yeah. Okay. So there was the day that we went to the vocational school, and so we got to talk with people who are learning different aspects of the agricultural jobs or jobs related to producing natural products from forage goods and that sort of thing. We went to a local brewery in Tornio, which was a fun experience as well. We went to a forestry museum.
We actually got to make some materials. So we came home with sort of a. So I don't. If you grew up on a farm or in some sort of rural setting, chances are your parents had some sort of universal salves that they gave you for whatever was ailing you, right? I know Sarah and I have talked about this. In Finland, it's like a spruce bomb, and I tweet a lot about stuff. So there's tons of pictures. You can go find me on there around. Just follow the ICRPS things. And so we got to learn how to make some of those things, like a beeswax kind of balm infused with spruce essence and with all kinds of other things. We also got to make nettle salt. So we spent some time with the folks that were doing those projects and kind of got to leave with a little product, which was really nice. The trip, we went to Santa's Village, which of course, the reindeer was really interesting because we got to hear from a herder and someone that's actually studying herding in terms of how reindeer harvesting is done. It's semi-domesticated. It's not like cattle. They are wild foraging and then kind of herded and shoots a couple times a year for calving and for culling. So it's a totally different thing. So getting to hear from some of those aspects was really interesting. As me collecting nettle for our nettle salt. And
there were a lot of bugs.
There were. It's
also
true to Northern Ontario.
Yeah.
Mosquitoes.
Another way that it's much like home.
But that's the other part of ICRPS, and I'm sure in Ireland and Brussels, one of the part of ICRPS that makes it so valuable as a student doing these field trips is you get to see stuff that you wouldn't see if you were just going on your own, right? So it's not, you're seeing some, yes, the tourism side. I mean, we were at Santa's Village, but it was also a powerful economic hub around how they've built that up as something that people could come and stay at Christmas time. And we got to hear different things than we would hear ordinarily. You're just kind of showing up saying, I want to go see the Northern Lights, and then also hear a little bit of other stuff that's going on. So that access is really important.
Also, if you want to see the Northern Lights, don't go in June, because I can't stress this enough, there is no nighttime ever.
I think one of our colleagues from Bologna said, one of the first words that Eduardo said to me were like, I miss the moon. So I think that don't go for the Northern Lights at some time. But I'm sure in Ireland and Brussels as well, when you get to see and hear different stories, because it's, you do a brewery tour and you get the kind of, one craft brewery kind of looks like all craft breweries, but you're hearing these incredible stories around how they resurrected a brewery that had been bought out by Heineken. Two local guys went toe-to-toe with Heineken's lawyers to say, we want to buy our brewery back, and not only our brewery, the recipe that you bought as well, we're going to buy that back from you. They found the original brewer who was in his 80s to find out what yeast was in it, what hops, what the brewing mechanisms were for that. So you get to hear these really amazing stories that are more than just like, oh, look at this beautiful craft brewery, which is always nice. I like beer, but is more around like the story of why that matters to Tornio in Finland.
I think one useful caveat to make, though, about the whole thing is that there are limitations to this kind of learning where you're being invited into another country that, like, especially since it was Finland's first year, or the University of Lapland's first year being part of ICRPS, you could tell that they really, really wanted us to be impressed and really wanted to show off to us. And so there are certain questions that you just don't get the answers to, because often you're talking with political figures, you're talking with representatives of the local government who don't really want to tell you the bad stuff. You kind of have to dig to uncover it, which some of us certainly tried our best to do.
Yeah, I asked a lot of questions, but and I think that goes to, I'm sure folks that are part of the program or have been for at least some of the first years may not have stumbled across it yet, but Ray Bowman is part of the faculty at ICRPS, and for rural studies in Canada, like, I nerded out completely when I sat next to Ray at our welcome bar. I was like, "You're Ray Bowman," but you know, one of the things that he told us that I took away from ICRPS and has continued is something that's a really big part of my research. What's not being said is listening very, very carefully, not only to the stories of people telling you, and this is really important if you're going to go out and do interviews, if you're going to go out and do case research. It was such an important reminder to not just listen to the things that people are telling you, but what's in the gaps. What are the things that we're not hearing? And for us, a lot of that was, I mean, there's so much fabulous stuff happening in Lapland, but when we came home, a lot of those questions were, well, we didn't really hear about that, or we didn't really hear about like people's opposition maybe to a circular economy, you know, asking around who loses, right? You're positioning this as something that a circular economy, everybody wins. That's impossible. Somebody's got to lose. And so who loses in this situation? And a lot of those conversations were kind of like, nobody, it's fine. So I think that's really interesting.
Yeah, or all my questions about the berry pickers that no one wanted to answer.
Yeah, no one wanted to touch those with a 10-foot pole. So
Yeah.
I'm just looking at the time. We've got like maybe 2 minutes if anybody's got any other questions. And also, Lou and I are still very much alive and part of the program, so you're welcome to send us emails. And I'm sure Scott and LaSalle and graduates of ICRPS as well would be happy to put you in touch with if you're interested in that. Information session is on the 16th. And that if you're at all considering it, it's worth just kind of going and finding out more around the logistics, the timing, whether this makes sense around the themes. The other thing is that for both of us, the themes of ICRPS this year, and I'm sure for Scott and others, it's really lined up to our research. So if this year isn't quite something that makes sense for you, don't be like, oh, I'm never going to get to go. Keep an eye out for 2021 as well. Like if you're still planning to be in the program, there's opportunities to look around how that's happening, and getting involved is never a bad idea. I'm fortunate that extra themes really line up for me, so now I'm going to be involved on the planning and steering committee for that. So it's a door into a whole other part of your career that's really
important. Just let people know if your applying session is October 16th. The deadline to apply is probably going to be the end of November, early December. We have to get each partner institution kind of gets a certain allocation of seats It's all based on the bus, how big of a bus travels the countryside, how many seats are available for us here at 12. Probably early December will be the deadline to apply. Brandon next year, around the future of rural and rural policy. 2021 most likely will be internal trends, looking at complexities of governance. And these always are taken from multiple different perspectives. So even under smart specialization, there was natural resources, there were agriculture, there were rural communities and migrations. So lots of things get pursued underneath the big umbrella.
So you said the 2020 theme very fast. I didn't grasp.
Future of rural.
Yeah.
The future of rural.
Oh, future.
And so if you're interested, there'll be a large, because of it being in Brandon, I think the plan right now is to be a large focus on their relationship, certainly to Indigenous people and First Nations, and around how that relationship, we're talking about the future of rural Canada, you know, like this is something we're wrestling with in very real time, and the location of Brandon really lends itself to talking about what's happening in rural Manitoba and those things. For context, it's a Manitoba, I believe it's a Manitoba-based in First Nations Business Development Corporation that actually owns most of the refurb happening at First Power. So these are things that even if you're not saying, well, what does Manitoba have to do with my research? There's always a connection. So, yeah.
Maybe on that front, give Lou and Ashley a round of applause for the sharing. The other to think about is the next speaker series session will take place on October 9th, Wednesday. It's going to be the only one that's a bit different in the fall semester. It'll actually take place in the library. It'll start at 10 in the morning and run from 10 till 12. And Chris Alley will be the presenter. He's from the University of Virginia. He'll be talking about broadband connectivity from the United States perspective and what we might learn from that. But it is at 10 in the morning, and it is in the 3rd floor of the library. So you'll see that in the announcements. So if you come here on the 9th of October and you're all by yourself, you'll remember at that moment that it's in another location.
It was earlier.
It was earlier and another location. But I encourage you to come out to hear Chris's presentation around broadband, something that everybody is dealing with coast to coast and country to country. So thanks again to Ashley and Lou, and for Mark, and we've also got Michelle and Scott that have been past ICRPS participants. Tap into that knowledge by all means. Thanks for joining. There's still a bit of food left if anybody would like some. So thanks again.
And the GSS elections are happening like now. So if you're going to be involved, I cleverly peer pressured you into saying for it. So if you're interested in the GSS, please stick around.
Stop recording.